Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Life After Furlough, episode 7 from the employment team at Wilkin Chapman Solicitors. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Teresa Thomas, and I'm joined by my fellow partner, Oliver Tasker. We seem to be a bit of a duo on these webinars since we started doing them. I mentioned to Oliver when we came on air a few moments ago that Boris Johnson was making an announcement to the MPs. Did he know what time it was? Because I've been busy in a meeting this morning, and he said, it's 12:30, Teresa. And I said, oh gosh, we're clashing with him. So thank you for listening to us rather than Boris Johnson, because of course, he's told us all the second wave of coronavirus is here in the UK. And we wait with bated breath for his announcement to us all at 8 o'clock tonight. What we know so far from today's leaks, obviously, is that the pubs are going to be shutting at 10 p.m, presumably because people only get drunk and don't social distance after 10 p.m. Why? I've no idea. Aren't people just likely to go out earlier? But I'm not here anyway to criticise government policy. We're obviously talking to you today about the employment implications. One of those that is being strongly hinted at this morning by Mr. Gove is that we're likely to be told again that we ought to work from home if we can. So, you know, that was in direct contradiction to the last government advice, and we'll have to see how that is going to impact on all of us and our employees. What we know also is that the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee has urged the government to consider a targeted extension to the coronavirus job retention scheme, which, as you all know, is set to end at the end of October. So whether what is going to happen later and over the coming days is going to change anything in relation to that, obviously watch this space, and Oliver and I will be updating you all on any implications it has for your business and your employees as soon as we are able to. We know that the Prime Minister and Chancellor previously rejected calls for an extension of the scheme, despite pressure on the union bodies and the Labour Party. So again, watch this space. In terms of today's webinar, we're going to cover in detail as much as we can the job retention bonus scheme, and talk about some issues around wearing face masks, covering, testing in the workplace, and carrying out remote disciplinary reviews. Please, because I'm going to join with the interactive polls that Oliver and I are going to launch. One thing I thought probably would be good to update you on is the impact that the coronavirus has had on the employment tribunal system. So by the end of August, there was a tribunal backlog of cases of over 45,000 cases waiting to go to hearing. That's up 26% from March. There are certainly a lot of extra claims being issued. Many aren't being sent to employers for many months after the claims have been filed with the tribunal. So don't think because you haven't had a claim through and you haven't heard from ACAS that everything is fine and your employee that you might have dismissed has run out of time to bring a claim, because it may land on your lap many months later. So based on where the scheme is today, Oliver, can you talk to us about the job retention bonus scheme, please?
Yes, so Richie announced way back in July, which seems a million years ago in some senses, that a new job retention bonus was going to be launched, and really it's there as an incentive for businesses and employers to keep on those individuals, those employees that have been furloughed at any point under the job retention scheme in meaningful employment once the scheme ends at the end of next month. Now, the bonus itself is a one-off payment of £1,000 per employee who is kept on and who remains continuously employed through to the end of January, so 31st of January 2021.
And what about the eligibility requirements? We've heard a lot about that there's going to be some. Can you give any more detail about that, Oliver?
Yeah, so firstly, all employers are eligible for the scheme, so to claim for the job retention bonus. So that includes recruitment agencies and umbrella companies as well. Because if you cast your mind back, way back when, to when the job retention scheme was initially launched, there was question marks over whether those businesses would qualify for the scheme itself, which they have. And yet all the same businesses can potentially qualify to claim for the job retention bonus. So what they will have to demonstrate and prove is A, that they're claiming for an employee who has been furloughed at some point under the job retention scheme. So no requirements in terms of length of time or when, or that they had to be or have to be furloughed come the end of October when the scheme itself actually ends. One requirement is that you have to have properly claimed for them under the scheme to qualify for the bonus. Secondly, the most important part is that those employees then remain employed, as I said earlier on, up until the 31st of January next year. In the months that they are employed, they also have to be paid an average of £520 per month. And that's still an area that we're actually awaiting the detailed guidance on how that figure is actually calculated and what payments you look at when you see if they have earned that during that period. And that's not to say that they have to earn £520 every month. So for November, December and January, it's an average taken over that period itself. Also, the business has to have the real-time information records for the period up to the end of January, so proving essentially to HMRC and audit-wise that they have been properly employed for that period. And also, it's important that they're not serving are not in a period of contractual statutory notice. So as a business, you've not got to the beginning of January and thought, well, this employee needs 5 weeks notice to be dismissed. I'm going to serve that upon them, but still claim for that individual come the end of January. They need to be in employment and not under notice as well to satisfy the criteria. So Teresa, in terms of the practicalities then, if a business satisfies those criteria, how do they actually make a claim come the end of January?
So the bonus claim can be made from February online. More details about the process are going to be published by the end of September. That's the promise that's been made. Whether that changes with what's happening currently, we'll keep our eye out on that. As you mentioned, Oliver, the payment is £1,000 for every eligible employee, but it's obviously taxable. So as an employer, you've got to make sure that you include that whole amount when calculating your taxable profits for corporation tax or self-assessment. So in terms of next steps, getting ready for claiming the bonus, obviously make sure your employee records are up to date. Including that you've claimed properly for each employee during the period that they were on furlough. Make sure that you're going to claim correctly through the real-time information reporting system, and make sure any necessary amendments to claims that have been made for your employees have already been previously notified to HMRC, because obviously, as we know from press reports, there are a number of individual companies who are being picked up for erroneously claiming amounts that they shouldn't. And also, there does seem to be more auditing going on, so that if there is anything picked up by HMRC, you've got to make sure you have amended and submitted any amendment requests by then.
So this brings us on to our first poll, if you can get ready with that, Kate, in the background. And really, with hearing about the job retention bonus itself, then, you as businesses, business owners, HR, will that actually make you retain jobs, do you anticipate? Is that going to be incentive enough to retain those that have been placed on furlough previously up until the end of January, given it's £1,000 per employee, but subject to tax as well. So if hopefully on your screen it's popped up the voting options, so you can either answer yes, it will make you retain jobs, no, it won't, or really not sure yet. So if you can cast your votes now, and we'll have a look at the results. There we go. Undecided or no is really the way that we're looking at it. Really, the £1,000 payment, depending on your business and sector, really is not going to make a huge difference if you haven't utilised the scheme. And really, given what we're facing potentially with more lockdown restrictions, I think that actively planning for your workforce properly and what levels you may need moving forward is really going to be the overriding objective, isn't it, to protect your business. But that really gives us an idea of how well used the bonus may be or not.
Absolutely, and it's interesting, those of you that have answered yes, you know, clearly you anticipate by the end of January you're still not going to be 100% sure about what your future needs for the employees are going to be. So it's going to encourage you to keep your employees, you know, on the payroll until then, and perhaps then, in light of receiving the bonus, review at that time into the future about any potential redundancies. Oliver, I want to turn to us talking about what appears to have been quite a tricky area since we've all been encouraged to be coming back to the workplace, and it's the issue around face masks. So what guidance can we give about asking employees to wear face masks?
Yeah, so there's two items that I'm going to consider and discuss under this. But firstly, as people know, in planning for a return to work, a return to the workplace, there's a whole host of health and safety obligations that you actually need to go through and consider for getting people back. So whether that's manufacturing, it's the office, it's whatever setting it may be, there's stringent health and safety requirements that you need to go through, to establish that it's a safe place to come back to and give that reassurance to the employees, but also to look at whether any other PPE may be required as well to provide to employees. So firstly, starting on the area of face masks. So these are the actual PPE, these are the clinical face masks that you see some people are wearing, rather than face coverings that we're now getting used to on wearing for public transport, that we're getting used to wearing when we go into shops, etc. So really what the guidelines state in terms of face masks is that when you're looking at managing the risk of COVID-19, any additional PPE beyond what you ordinarily use within your working environment isn't necessarily going to be beneficial. There's obviously exceptions for those that come into close contact and those that are on clinical settings. So doctors, hospitals, dentists, they all have to. Hairdressers that we've been to now since lockdown are wearing visors and face masks and coverings as well. But really the guidance is because the government and the health organisations recommend, well, the best way to stop the spread of COVID-19 is through other measures that we're also used to now. So the social distancing, hygiene measures, hand sanitizers, and looking to rotate teams and limit the numbers that are actually backing the workplace as well. So whilst they don't recommend or encourage the additional use of face masks, what they do say is that really you need to carry out a risk assessment. And as you know, and getting your premises COVID secure risk assessments are key in doing that. So if actually your risk assessment demonstrates that potentially because you are in close contact with your employees, or your employees are in close contact, that you've identified a need for additional PPE, that needs to be provided free of charge for workers who need it, and it also must fit properly as well. So really it's only those that are identified as part of an additional risk assessment. Now on face coverings, the ones that we're wearing to shops, using for public transport, had quite a lot of clients that have come to us to say, well, should we be using these, say, in the office or in the workplace as well? Because when we go to shops, we need to wear them. Now, the government's been quite clear in this. Matt Hancock, Michael Gove, they've been asked on numerous occasions, well, are you actually going to extend face coverings to the workplace as well? And they've been quite categorical and clear, saying, no, we're not going to at this stage. Now, again, I have various clients that have said to their employees, it's your decision. If you want to wear a face covering, for example, when you're sat at your desk, because you are concerned about close proximity, or when you get up and roam around in more of the communal areas, maybe the kitchen area, corridors, etc., then that is your decision on whether you want to do that. And again, the guidelines state that yes, you can support any works employees that want to wear face coverings, but really make it clear that that goes hand in hand with all the other measures again as well. So wash your hands, avoid touching your face, replace your face covering if it becomes damp or isn't actually secure, to release those droplets out, which is the key area, and really wash the face coverings daily as well. But really, it's maintain, practice social distancing within the workplace. That is key, and that message has been made clear time and time again. Now, one area that you may need to be mindful of if you are looking to impose or think about maybe drafting a policy or procedure for your workplace on face coverings itself, is to avoid really unilaterally imposing it. And as we've seen with the other return to work measures, it's that communication and consultation that's been important to reassure people it's a safe place to come back to. There could be discrimination issues, for example, if you do impose it. So as we've seen in public, not everybody is wearing face coverings because of medical conditions. And again, that needs to be taken into account. And if you are looking at policies on face coverings for people returning to work, it may also inhibit communication. Generally communication, but also for those who rely upon lip reading, for example, or facial expressions because of a disability. So really be mindful of those points. Now that brings us on to our second poll today. Kay, if you can launch that. And this is looking at the next area that we're going to be talking about and discussing. And that is, has your business actually implemented any COVID checks? I think that's the first poll again, Kay, if you can change that to the second poll. So has your business implemented any COVID checks in the workplace at the moment? For example, have you implemented temperature checks? I've seen going to some restaurants or bars that on entering the premises, you need to have a temperature check, or they ask you to take a temperature check to confirm that you don't have a temperature, as it's one of the key symptoms, isn't it, of coronavirus. So they are becoming commonplace, particularly abroad as well. I understand Dubai, it's quite commonplace for workplaces to have it, but interesting to hear, if the poll works, that is, whether any businesses here have implemented such checks or maybe are considering it. Oh, there we go. Has your business implemented any checks? So yes, no, or are you considering it? If you can vote away now. Give you another couple of seconds to cast your vote, and then hopefully we'll get it on screen, the results. There we go. Yeah, interestingly, quite a split, really, between yes and no, and small number considering it. So that's interesting to see. I'd also be interested to see those that have answered yes for COVID checks. If you get an opportunity within the webinar chat function, if you just state which industry you're in, I'd be interested to read those as we go along. But that brings us to the next section, Teresa, that you're going to speak about is, well, can employers actually lawfully conduct those temperature checks on employees, and really what are their options?
Yeah, certainly my experience with the employer clients that I act for is those in the food sector who pretty much have been working, let's say, as normal throughout this whole period, introduced temperature checking pretty early on as one of the means of trying to protect their staff and ensure that they all felt safe coming to work. But the lawfulness of temperature checking is actually a pretty complex area. As we know now, or the promise from the government is that staff and residents in care homes for the over 65s and those for dementia are receiving the regular tests as part of the new social care strategy. But temperature checks for employees, and then Oliver's going to turn to talking about COVID tests for employees, are far more a serious and difficult issue. The first issue that it needs considering in detail is data protection. So this, some of us feel, is perhaps been the bane of our lives over the last few years, but it really is at the forefront, and the employees are aware very much so also of their rights in respect of data protection. So obviously health information that you gain and glean from your employees is a special category of personal data, and you can only process that as an employer on certain grounds. So the ICO have, I don't know if any of you have had any bedtime reading, but if you look at the ICO's coronavirus recovery document, it states, which is common sense really, as long as there's a good reason for doing so, as an employer, you can carry out health testing on your employees, whether it's COVID testing, temperature checking or whatever. So it doesn't stop you from taking necessary steps to keep your employees and the public safe during the pandemic. And one of the permitted grounds under the legislation for processing this health data is for health purposes. So I think everybody's got maybe a little bit sick of doing risk assessments, but what you need to do is a data protection impact assessment if you're going to look to take temperature checks from your employees. Now, you know, obviously at the present time, you've got to make sure that you're not collecting anything unnecessary or excessive information. For example, the only thing you really need to be collecting and retaining on your systems are the actual test results. You don't need to be retaining details of any underlying conditions. You also need to consider what testing options are available so that you're only collecting that information that is necessary and proportionate. I know one of the local food processors, every day their staff, when they come into work, have to sign something to say that they don't have any COVID symptoms and they have to have their temperature checked. And literally all is kept on the employee's file is that they got a green light on that day to enter into work and continue their working day. So what you need to be able to do as an employer is really demonstrate the reason for testing the employees. Well, most employees are gonna, I think, be reassured that you're doing it to protect themselves, one of the health and safety measures, and that you're just keeping the test results.
And is there any practical guidance that you can give on the implementation or steps that need to be taken?
Certainly, in terms of the data protection point of view, I think reassure the employees, tell them what personal data you're going to be taking from them, how you're going to use it, who you're going to share it with. Obviously, keep it within a very tight group of, in terms of the HR department, and only management on an absolute need-to-know basis. How long you're going to keep it for as the employer, and what decisions you're gonna make based on those test results. So before you launch any sort of temperature checking or other checking, make sure that you've put in place those steps and that the employees are being made aware of the information you're going to keep and hold. I said it was quite a complex area. That's sort of a whistle-stop tour through data protection. But of course, there are a lot more other areas, which I'm just going to touch on briefly for you to be considering and taking into account. Because, of course, consent is a very important thing. It's not grounds itself to retain the data under the data protection, but clearly if you're going to administer any sort of testing, including temperature testing, you need the employee's consent to do that. If you try and do it without consent, then potentially we're looking at a repudiatory breach of contract, in plain English, a potential unfair constructive dismissal claim, and also potential assault on the individual. So if, as an employer, you do, on a practical level, have a situation where you've got somebody that's refusing to have a test, you need to have thought in advance, well, what are we going to do? What is the outcome going to be if somebody is not prepared to consent to a test? Now, if your business would need to temporarily close, or you're going to have to send employees and workers home during the pandemic, unless you can take those tests, then obviously there are very strong reasons for taking the test, and I don't think consent would really be an issue. And as I've mentioned, probably will reassure more people than it will scare them in relation to doing it. On holiday, I was on holiday last week in Jersey, and you all have to have a COVID test, for example, before they let you into the country. One of the only countries that's doing that. But actually, it was quite a reassurance once you knew that you'd got your result, that everybody else that you were walking around with and mixing with was also negative. So in terms of the temperature checking, again, that provides that reassurance. Now, what it can be, though, is only, as Oliver mentioned, part of a series of measures protecting your staff and their health and safety during the pandemic. What I would say is the World Health Organization isn't recommending that employers put in place temperature checking. So it's not requiring you to do it, it's not even suggesting you should, but if you want to, certainly you can. In terms of discrimination around temperature checking and testing is completely in contrast to Oliver was mentioning about the face masks and covering. So if you're going to do any sort of medical testing on employees, workers, visitors during the COVID-19, then you've got to apply it to everybody. Because if you only test certain groups that you perceive are at higher risk of contracting the virus or becoming more seriously ill with the virus, then that in itself could lead to discrimination claims. So any sort of health testing, screening, temperature checking needs to be for everybody. I've touched on it a few times, but over to you, Oliver. Can you talk people through, can they make staff take a COVID test as an alternative to providing reassurance?
Yeah, some employers are certainly moving that way, particularly given we've seen the immense pressure and strain on the NHS or the government test and trace programme, haven't we? Both locally and around the country, where people are not being able to get tests soon, or certainly not locally, and are having to travel for those. And you'll have seen that again, Matt Hancock doing the rounds in the media, blaming actually individuals who are not displaying any symptoms for turning up to have tests done. And that's perhaps why employers are now making their own arrangements in order to implement their own testing programs, particularly from a business continuity perspective and a safety perspective as well. So there's obviously no obligation on an employer to do it, but the Department for Health and Social Care has issued some guidance, really, again, to back up why we shouldn't, as employers, as businesses, be sending individuals off to the testing centres if they're not displaying symptoms. So firstly, it's really considering the scope of any testing programme as well. And as Teresa mentioned about temperature checks, really consider who will be tested and how often it will take place as well. and how those test results obviously will be used, and taking people out of the business if they have in fact tested positive. Communication again is going to be key, and whether you need to involve any staff forums that you've got established within the workplace, or unions that are within the workplace as well, to consult with prior to implementing a policy of carrying out COVID tests. And again, you really need to be aware about the data protection GDPR implications that Teresa has been through, as well as health and safety requirements as well. One interesting area actually as well is if you have a testing program within the workplace, you're then obviously doing tracing as well. So if somebody tests positive, you'll be notifying people that they may have come in contact with that they should be potentially self-isolating. Those individuals that then have to self-isolate do not actually qualify for SSP under all the changes that we've seen to the SSP, statutory sick pay regulations. Those individuals that have not been contacted through official channels, so the official NHS test and trace programme, are not entitled to receive statutory sick pay, which may lead and result in the fact that if they do have to self-isolate, that they're entitled to full pay. So it's an area, or a secondary area, that a business and employer needs to consider if you're thinking about implementing these test programs, and then the implications that that then brings to it. So really, if you've got the health and safety reasons for carrying out the tests, well, what's the knock-on effect for employees? One area is that some employees may consider that it's an invasion of their privacy. Because I mean, it's quite uncomfortable, the test itself. I don't know how you found it, Teresa, in Jersey, but it is quite involved in terms of either throat or nose swab, isn't it? So it's not the most comfortable of tests. So I understand, particularly those employees that aren't displaying any symptoms may be fairly reluctant to do that. Where an employer or business is in a bit of a stronger position to look to implement such tests is where social distancing really is a problem. And that's certainly going to have a knock-on effect as well for the temperature checks. Where social distancing is an issue, you would think actually people and employees will be a little bit more open to testing, whether that's for actually COVID test or for temperature checks as well. But on what basis could you take action if an individual actually refuses to take a test that you've implemented? Well, one option is that you could look, well, is there a reasonable management instruction that you're asking your employees to undergo a test? And the backup to that is really you're there to put measures in place to protect the health and safety of all your employees. And that's one tool that you're utilising to demonstrate and use that. So it's a potential area, but really you'd need to look at a more formal policy again, and within that you're building in the justification on why you are imposing those tests. So going back to the GDPR data protection justification, the risk assessments, the health and safety, all of that would be built into your policy itself then to justify why you as exercising your duty of care as an employer is carrying out those tests. Whether you could argue it's a breach of contract, well, that would depend upon what policy you do put in place and whether that's contractual or not. Realistically, you're going to have to go down a disciplinary route, but decide under the circumstances with any disciplinary action based on conduct, well, is it actually reasonable for that individual to refuse the test, and therefore reasonable upon me as an employer to take any disciplinary action itself as a result of that failure. But all of these areas, as we slowly go back to the workplace or return home by the looks of the announcement, are certainly going to be areas for a long time to come that we're going to be tested as in terms of businesses and issues that we're going to be facing on a lot more frequent basis. Which actually brings us on to, conveniently, point number 3. Teresa's in a moment going to be looking at and going through some tips for conducting disciplinary grievance investigation meetings, hearings remotely. So we actually thought it'd be quite interesting, given how long we have been in lockdown or without employees within the workplace, potentially for a lot of businesses, is, well, how many of you have actually carried out such meetings and hearings remotely? So whether that's via Zoom, Teams, whatever it may be, have you carried out disciplinary investigation grievance meetings over those platforms? And did you find it straightforward? Did you find it a complete nightmare, whether that's in terms of the technology itself or the engagement from the employee, is some issues that we're seeing, or have you avoided it at all costs? Well, that's an overwhelming result, and the majority have avoided it at all costs. And I think particularly for probably those businesses that have been fortunate enough that haven't had to look at any redundancy or redundancy consultation, I imagine, yes, as we've seen within the results, the overwhelming desire is to try and avoid such hearings, and maybe to push back any issues that you may actually be facing with your workforce as well, whether it's from a disciplinary perspective or a grievance perspective. So Teresa, what tips can you provide so people face up to those challenges moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting that so many of you have avoided it, because I think one thing that this second wave issue brings to the fore is really it was okay trying to postpone hearings or investigations for what we thought initially was going to be a short period of time and wait for things to return to normal. The reality is, and I think is all hitting home to all of us, that we're going to be using remote hearings and a remote investigation for many months to come. So my first sort of top tip is don't push things back, don't avoid it, because as an employer you need to act within a reasonable time frame of any issue being raised with you, whether that's a grievance or a disciplinary issue. And part of the time scale goes to whether you've followed a fair process in relation to that investigation and or discipline or grievance hearing. Now, obviously, yes, it's not so easy when you're interviewing witnesses or undertaking hearings when you're doing them through a remote medium. It's hard to build rapport, absolutely. It's harder to pick up on people's gestures, certainly, and their demeanour. So it is hard to do them well, but here's some tips for doing those hearings and hopefully getting the most that you possibly can out of them. The first thing is you definitely need to allow more time for your hearing, because it does take longer. I think we've all got used to the sort of the Zoom and the Teams delay that you have in relation to doing these things by a remote medium rather than face to face. So make sure you allow plenty of time for your hearings. Make sure at the beginning that you, as the sort of chair of the hearing, run through the etiquette of the hearing and the order of events at the start of the hearing. Otherwise, what some employers have experienced is everybody talking over each other and not much being achieved in these hearings, particularly on disciplinary hearings when people can be quite agitated. And the problem then becomes that the hearing ends up being shorter because you feel like you're not getting anywhere and you bring it to a close quicker than you should do. So make sure you run through that etiquette at the start of the hearing. One thing that is very important is to make sure that the person, that the employee that you're interviewing or other individual that you're interviewing is in a confidential environment with some privacy, because you may be talking about confidential matters, and people are not always just in a room on their own. Another solicitor that I was talking to on the phone a couple of weeks ago was talking about this in terms of the remote tribunal hearings, because we have been having remote tribunal hearings, and they were saying, well, we're worried that somebody might be off camera giving the person some help passing them documents or making points and sliding pieces of paper over. So make sure when you're doing any of these sort of hearings that you specifically say to the individual that you are interviewing, you know, is it only you present in the room? And make sure there's only agreed parties. They might have a right to be accompanied with them, but normally they're also by a remote means. So make sure you ask that question clearly at the beginning. We also need to consider about recording, because as we know, it's very easy to record Zoom meetings, Teams meetings, but you need to be very clear in your invite whether you're going to be recording the meeting or whether you're going to be taking summary minutes, and make sure that is agreed early on and everybody is agreeing whether it's going to be recorded or not. The other thing is how to deal with documents. When you're all sat face to face and you're looking at the document pack that's been sent out for the hearing, it's easy, isn't it, to say, well, we're talking about this particular, you know, this is the thing that we're talking about. You know, don't want to sound too lawyerish, but actually, if you've got more than a few documents that you're sending out for any grievance or disciplinary hearing, make sure you're sending a bundle that's page numbered, either PDF or by a hard copy, so that everyone's got the same documents and easy access. I suppose the thing is, it's not ideal to be doing them remotely, but you know, press on and don't delay. But if you decide you really need to have a face-to-face meeting with an individual, whether you're interviewing them as a witness, is a disciplinary or a grievance, or indeed a redundancy consultation, if it actually needs to be face-to-face, make sure you reassure them about the arrangements being COVID safe. And if they're concerned about coming to the workplace, you can always do it at a neutral venue. So they are my top tips for conducting hearings remotely and making sure they're fair or fair as possible at this time. Now, it's now over to you as our attendees and participants in the webinar in terms of asking any questions. So you can either put those in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. So in terms of the Q&A, we've got one question in there, Oliver, which says, I'll over to you because it's a face mask issue, but it says, if we introduce a policy to wear face masks in communal areas and an employee refuses to do so even after a reasonable discussion, what action could be taken? Is it similar to what we advised if they refuse to have a test?
Yeah, so where you are, you've implemented a policy, you've obviously found a health and safety requirement or carried out a risk assessment to justify it. And it's particularly those communal areas or those where you come into close contact with fellow colleagues that are potentially identified as a risk. And if you're saying it's for the benefits and for the health and safety of everybody by implementing this policy, and an individual refuses to do so, then yes, it's a potential disciplinary matter. If they don't have any medical conditions or under an exemption why they are refusing to do so, and are bloody minded almost, well, A, it'd be disappointing, but yeah, B, it's absolutely a misconduct issue, because you're implementing it for the protecting the health and safety of everybody. And with health and safety, as an employer, you are potentially vicariously liable for the actions of your employees as well. And that's the reason why you're putting those measures and steps in place. So yes, you can look to discipline under those circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do know some employers that have done that. And when the employee has actually realised they're taking it that seriously and they're potentially facing a warning, they have complied. So hopefully if any of you have those issues, then that can be resolved by the disciplinary process.
There's one within the Zoom chat that Andrew asks, that it states that he understands the requirement to consult with and gain approval for staff members for temperature checks. But what about gaining approval for any visitors to the office premises?
Absolutely, Andrew. When you've done your risk assessment for the staff, you also should make sure you've done your risk assessment for any visitors attending. And so when the visitors attend, make sure your receptionist is duly, briefed in relation to this, to explain to visitors when they come. And it's always a good idea, obviously, for the member of staff that's made the appointment, also for the visitor to attend, to say to them, we've carried out a risk assessment as a business, and we wish to undertake and are undertaking temperature checking for our staff and all of our visitors. So that will be taking place when you arrive. Tell them that they need to ensure that they pass that temperature check before they will be allowed on site, and reassure them that you're doing it for their safety and the safety of your staff. Again, I can't see anybody disagreeing with that, but better to be told in advance and then make sure the receptionist is fully briefed so that can take place. So certainly, yes, that shouldn't be an issue at all, hopefully, for any visitors attending. Oliver, there's a question in the Q&A about a director. If a director has been furloughed, are they entitled to claim the £1,000 in February if they're still employed?
Yes, yeah. So directors, it was finally confirmed that they were covered by the job retention scheme in itself, so could be furloughed. So as long as they hit the eligibility requirements for the bonus, so that they're properly furloughed under the terms of the scheme, and then the minimum earning requirements through to the end of January, then absolutely yes, the business is entitled to claim the £1,000 bonus for directors. Yeah.
That's great. We haven't got any more questions, I don't think, under the Q&A or the chat. So if anybody wants to ask a question about anything relating to furlough, the bonus, or what we've discussed today, you've got a few more minutes where you can have a bit of free advice from Oliver or myself. So feel free to get typing.
See that Sharon's got her hand up, but if you type in your question, Sharon, whether that's to the chat or the Q&A, then do so, then we can answer it if you've not already done that as part of the Q&A.
Yeah. I'll keep talking because it's not coming up.
Yeah.
Yet. And we can't come to you if you're not a co-host, Sharon. So we need you to get typing, I'm afraid, whilst we're talking. I just wanted to pick something up that you mentioned, Oliver, about the COVID testing. And yeah, it wasn't the most pleasant experience, I have to say, but quite reassuring. I have had a couple of employer clients that senior management have said, right, we're going to COVID test everybody regularly, because then that will reassure everyone and it'll be, it'll be okay. And what they haven't thought about is it really necessary? And what if somebody refuses? Because it is much more intrusive than walking into work and having somebody hold something up to your forehead in terms of the COVID test. You've got to reassure the individual about where the test's going to go. As an employer, you're going to have to pay for that test, those tests to be done, so they can be quite expensive. So I certainly have been advising my clients that COVID testing is not really a great way of giving the reassurance, and the temperature that we've been temperature checking is much better way of ensuring some reassurance, but without going too far in terms of what the COVID testing is.
I think there's been a question on the Q&A about temperature checks, and can you be asked to produce evidence that temperature checks are being kept by employers? So retention of data perspective question.
I'm not sure whether you're asking from the point of view, anonymous attendee, of the employees. In other words, are the employees seeking reassurance, or being asked by a third party? I have had instances where employers have been contacted by the local councils when they know that they're carrying out either COVID tests or temperature checks to see if they can have access to the results. And the firm answer to that is no, because as per the information I went through with earlier, data protection is an issue here, and therefore you need to be agreeing and telling your employees what you're doing with their data, and you're most certainly not going to be releasing it to any third party that might nosily want to know what your temperature check results are. What some employers have done with COVID testing is told their local authority that if anybody tests positive from their own private COVID test, that they categorically confirm that they will send them for an NHS test, so that they are then tested within the scheme, and that they will also do that with any tests that come back I can't remember the phraseology that they use now, but they're not, I think they're inconclusive, I think is what they call in terms of the test results, neither negative or positive. That they would send them as well. Hopefully that's answered your question. Wasn't entirely sure from the angle at which you were. Yes, this is what I mean by the local authority. No, you can't release to the local authority without the consent of your employees. Why do they need to know? Back them away is my view. Sharon put a question in there, if you can take that, Ollie. We have now got issues with staff off due to their kids being sent home from school. Yes, the schools do seem obviously being very cautious. They are coming in when they should be self-isolating. We have sent them home. Do we have to pay them when they should have been self-isolating following the school's advice? Can you pick that one up, Oliver?
Yeah, so for individuals that need to be self-isolating because they've come into contact, so under the test and track and trace element, then, well, it's a legal requirement, isn't it now, to do so, that they have to do so for a period of 14 days. And SSP regs are amended that those individuals would be included. So if they are contacted because they have come into contact with somebody with COVID-19, then SSP is payable. So absolutely send them home, and they're entitled to SSP rather than full pay.
Yeah, I think what's happening with a lot of the schools is the child's got a sniffle, and they send them home out of caution. And say, well, send them off to have a test. There's a delay with the tests at the moment, so we've got a bit of that. Would be time off for dependents for emergency leave if you needed to go and get the child from school because they needed a test, unpaid, that is. So don't forget that we fall back to the old and original regime about unpaid time off for dependents if they need caring for. So, but if they should be self-isolating because there's a positive test, as Oliver says, they must stay at home. You can force them to stay at home, and they're entitled to the SSP.
Yeah, it may be the case that whole year groups are being sent home, aren't they? Because they all form part of the same bubble, and somebody within that has tested and positive. But as Teresa said, normal principles apply.
Andrew's raised a further question. What are the implications and actions an employer must take if a member of staff receives a positive test? You want to pick that up, Oliver?
Yeah, so I mean, it is happening. So while locally in Lincolnshire we've been relatively lucky thus far, haven't we, in terms of rates and impact upon businesses, it is going to happen. So have an action plan in place. So if a member of staff notifies you that they have become tested positive for it, then they need to notify NHS Test and Track and Trace, don't they? and provide all the details of those people that they've come in contact with, including those at the workplace. So you as an employer can help facilitate that and that process as well. In terms of notifying individuals, so they'll receive a call from the NHS that they've been in contact and need to self-isolate. You can notify individuals within the workplace that they may have come in contact as well. You don't, or be mindful of not necessarily disclosing the person's identity. Again, thinking about GDPR requirements about that, but you can state that potentially you could come in contact with an individual and therefore you're recommending that they do self-isolate, and you could send them home and they'll then be contacted by the track and trace.
Absolutely. So whilst we've been on air, Boris Johnson has told the MPs that any new COVID restrictions are going to be, could last for 6 months. Well, I don't think there's any surprise in relation to that, seeing as where we are now. He's talked about the pubs, bars and the restaurants, and confirmed, as we suspected, that people should work from home if they can. So whether he's going to tell us anything more at 8 o'clock tonight remains to be seen. But what I can say is if there are any changes in relation to furlough, to the bonus, or to any other things that where you employers need some advice, then obviously we will put in place another webinar to hopefully assist you with any decision making you need to make. Other than that, thank you very much indeed for listening to us this afternoon, and hopefully we will see you soon. Well, remotely stroke virtually, even if I haven't seen many of you face to face for such a long time, including Oliver, that is. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.